Hello, I'm Robin Yeamans, a certified family law specialist in California since 1980. I've practiced law full-time since I graduated from Stanford Law School in 1969. I've been an attorney for 34 years now. I've passed the examination to be an appellate law specialist, so hopefully by the time you see this video, I will have a dual specialization, and I'll also be a specialist in appellate law as well as family law. Today, we're going to be discussing custody psychological evaluations and how to dissect them. Now, our starting point for doing this is an indication when parents come to you, and a lot of parents are angry and they're saying, this evaluation, this report does not describe me, and children are getting sent to a parent and they are saying, I don't want to go. What should an attorney do at this point? The attorney should listen, check it out, and don't assume that the report is correct. What is the worst approach that can be taken? When an attorney gets a custody or psychological evaluation, but usually it may trash mom, but not always. It may be dad who gets trashed, and mom thinks, wow, the attorney thinks, wow, I didn't know she was so crazy, and the attorney then focuses on getting mom to accept the inevitable, which is that custody is going to the other party. Want to move it up for me? And mom gets the evaluation and thinks, wow, I didn't know I was so crazy. Maybe I'm so crazy that I can't tell I'm crazy. Often, this is a battered person, and it can take them 2 years after being emotionally battered by the court and the psychologist before they recover enough to realize the report was junk and didn't describe them at all. In fact, I've had the experience of telling a battered mother, you are not psychotic. If you get a report that says that a normally functioning, employed person has severe emotional disturbance, the attorney and the parent should give serious thought to challenging this report. Now, the first thing that can happen when a report is challenged is what we will call here the surface approach. What happens in this case, one person may hire an MFCC, a counselor, to come in and testify the report is no good. So the other person goes out and hires a PhD psychologist to say the report is no good. Well, what's higher than a psychologist in the hierarchy? A psychiatrist. So the other person goes out and hires a psychiatrist to say the report is no good. Then the other person goes and gets a nationally or internationally known psychiatrist. And then the other parent has to go and get 2 internationally known psychiatrists. The result is, you want to move that way up? Everybody testifies, but nobody understands a word of it, including the judge. And the end result is that the one who hires the expert with the heaviest credentials wins. And the result of that usually is the party who had the most money ends up getting custody. That's a terrible approach. Now we go to what we call the skim the surface approach. I had a case where we did hire 2 very good PhD psychologists, and they realized that the Behaviordyne computer scoring service, which was the one I happened to be using, was scoring the MMPI-2 personality test as if it were an original MMPI test. Let me move that up. The problem was they didn't share the data with me, and they didn't actually realize that the work the psychologist was doing was so bad it amounted to a hoax on the court. Next slide. Now, in discussing psychological tests with you today, I'm going to be discussing one particular computer scoring service, which was initially called Behavior Data, and after it went through bankruptcy and moved down the street, it called itself Behavior Dine. But it doesn't matter which computer scoring service or psychologist you're dealing with. What we're talking about here is a scientific approach to dissecting evaluations. So what we're talking in general is an approach, an understanding that these evaluations are knowable. They are understandable both by parents and by attorneys. And if you determine that you are an intelligent person who can know a subject and do some intellectual wrestling with a subject, you can do this. Now, the next worst approach is what I call the high priest of holy mysteries approach, claiming that only psychologists can have access to raw data. Some psychologists refuse to let the lawyers or the clients, the person tested, see the data on which their opinions are based. It is as if the raw data are holy mysteries and only the high priests, who are psychologists, can see these holy mysteries. The psychologists tell the lawyers and the judges, "Trust me, I'm the expert." Well, this idea that raw data are a secret which cannot be shared with anyone is ridiculous. Here's an example of a very famous murder case where the Rorschach cards, which the psychologists absolutely will not let you see, were published on the front page of the local section of the San Jose Mercury News. And I should add they were published in color, although this slide is in black and white. They act like it's a major secret. This is the front page of the newspaper. Now, next slide. In addition to that, if you get in touch with the American Psychological Association, the APA, and you get this book, the MMPI, MMPI-2, and MMPI-A in court, it lists all of the questions that are on the MMPI-2 test itself. There are a lot of books like this one, Essentials of MMPI-2 and MMPI-A Interpretation by Butcher and Williams. These, for example, list critical items that go into into elevating your scores on different scales, and they explain what scores are really important, what scores will elevate your score, your pathology. Of course, one of my favorite ones, particularly in the divorce and child custody case, it's considered pathological if you answer the question, "My sex life is satisfactory," false. So you're supposed to, when you're divorcing and having a particularly difficult time, answer it true. So it also shows, these books are also very important and give an idea, for example, when a person gives an answer that gives them an elevated score, why you need to know the person and understand that it is not pathological for a person who is separated from their spouse to say their sex life is unsatisfactory. Of course, as one of my clients said to me, "My sex life is perfectly satisfactory. I have none at all." So it shows the psychologist does need to question a person as to the meaning of these true and false answers. You can't just have a computer printing out answers. So we do have a problem getting the raw data. And the problem is made worse when you as an attorney hire a psychologist and the psychologist refuses to share the raw data with the attorney who hired the psychologist, and then the psychologist gives us an opinion, but we can't really find out what the basis of the opinion was, and maybe we know the client very well. Maybe we know the client thinks, I have no sex life and that's perfectly acceptable to me, but the expert we've hired may not know the person that well. Or, there was another answer here that was, various answers raise your scores, some more and some less. Oh, here's one. True or false? I have numbness in one or more places on my skin. Well, maybe you have a person who's had an accident or had some kind of actual cut or injury to their skin. So maybe when some people answer that, maybe it's in their mind, but maybe when this particular client says that they've had an industrial injury that their lawyer knows about, that the hired expert won't know about. And so we lawyers need to be able to see the raw data. Next. Well, what is the right approach to dissecting a psychological evaluation? Number one, you must get all the raw data, especially computer printouts. Number two, you must learn the subject in some ways better than the expert you're dealing with. You lawyers will be glad to know you don't have to learn the statistics like a PhD psychologist. That will not be necessary. And number three, you must go way below the surface to get the truth. In many ways, what we are talking about doing here today is like prying the lid off of a paint can that is stuck, and you are going to have to get your screwdriver and get the lid off of that paint can. Now, in the year around 400 BC, Sun Tzu, whose writings are collected in The Art of War, said, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. Now, in the custody and psychological evaluation context, this means investigate the expert, evaluate your case, fight if you can win, and settle if you're going to lose. So that in the war context, you don't have to worry about losing the battle because you run away or retreat. In the court context, retreat is known as settle the case. That's why you don't have to worry about losing. Of course, every now and then we do find settlement impossible. Now, in the case that we were dealing with behavior dying, behavior data, the software was bought by some people out of bankruptcy court, and we went and checked out the bankruptcy papers. And interestingly enough, the bankruptcy laws are sufficiently old that they require the people to list livestock among their assets, but there is no blank asking if they own computer software, which is what the major asset was that this company had. When we went and checked out their bankruptcy papers, we found two witnesses who proved to be very important in the case. One was a grad student who had been hired to update their software from DSM-3 to DSM-4, whose fees they wiped out in bankruptcy and never paid, but he was in possession of a copy of the software. Obviously, it's normally going to be quite difficult to get access to a copy of the computer program of the company you're dealing with, but this person had a copy of the software. And number two, we were able to locate the person who originally wrote the software of the computer scoring company back in the 60s. So through the bankruptcy papers, we located these witnesses. Whenever you are dealing with any parties who have litigation, you want to see the papers. In any divorce, you go down to criminal court and see, is there drunk driving? Are there domestic violence charges against whoever you're dealing with? Next. Know the enemy and know yourself. True dissection cannot be done to a good, competent report. A report must contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Sun Tzu says, to secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, but the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. In other words, if the report is based on the current professional literature, is ethical, and reflects both the concrete realities of the family and basic humane values, it can't be attacked except in a manipulative, superficial way, which is not going to do you any good in court. Now, a custody evaluation based on psychological tests, as to that kind of evaluation, its strength is the same as its weakness. What do we mean by that? The use of psychological testing and phraseology gives the report an appearance of science and authority. The judge feels like deferring to it and does not understand its words. However, the misuse of the test is relatively easy to prove, and then the report collapses like a house of cards over the improper testing or improper use of testing. In that sense, an evaluation based on testing is much easier to rebut than a custody evaluation based on clinical observations, which usually just means personal experience, and opinions, which usually just means personal biases. The latter kind of report is much harder to rebut and almost impossible to dissect. We're focusing on the kind of report today that uses testing. As to the kind of report that is solely based on clinical observations, I recommend Volume 1 of a 3-volume work of Ziskin, Z-I-S-K-I-N. I have that with me today. Coping with Psychiatric and Psychological Testimony. I have the 5th edition here. Next slide. It's a very good 3-volume work which I have used many times. Now, an MMPI-2 printout has 2 basic parts. One part is called the profile, and the other part is sentences. The profile is a graph. Now, this was standardized on thousands of people. What does standardized mean? Now, when we define mental health or mental illness, who's to say what is normal? We live in a society full of lots of different kinds of people and people with many different opinions. And we don't try to define normal. What the psychologists do is they give a test to a group of people, and then we say that the scores are normative. And we have a group of people who are not in prison, not in an inpatient psychiatric setting, and we use them as the normative group. In general, that's how tests are normed. The MMPI-2 was normed on a lot of people. That's one of the advantages to it. It's hard to get that big a group. First there was the original MMPI, then there was the MMPI-2, which has been normed on over 1,000 people. So it's got a big normative base, and there's an attempt also to make it um, geographically spread out and economically spread out. So it has a pretty good normative base. There are various computer companies that will score an MMPI-2 test, and they print out both a profile and many sentences. Now I have with me a sample of a report. I'm working on a case right now, in fact, it's getting ready for trial. This one is by the Caldwell report, which is a highly regarded computer printout company, unlike the Behaviordyne printout that I was dealing with in this other case. And first, the report discussed test-taking attitudes, and then they have what they call symptoms and personality characteristics, where they talk about my client. Then they have diagnostic impression. In this case, it says she obtained a basic normal profile, and then treatment considerations. Now, many, perhaps most psychologists copy the sentences here that describe her right into their report. I had no idea this was going on. I thought these psychologists were sitting down and interviewing people and just writing these reports. And I'm quite certain that that's what the judges think is going on too. But if you get the printout and you look at the report, you're going to see that many of these people are copying sentences straight from this printout into the report. So the problem is, how accurately do these computer-generated sentences describe the person they're dealing with? Now, one of the things about the Caldwell report is at the end, it has the honesty to say. The preceding analysis is basically actuarial and probabilistic in nature, in that the blah, blah, blah. So what it's talking about is probably the person described here is described by these sentences, but maybe they are not. So what that means is if there's a 60% chance that the sentence describes the person, there is also a 40% chance that the sentence has absolutely nothing to do with the person who is described. How do you, as a litigant or as an attorney, find out whether sentences have been copied into a report? And if so, how do you find out whether those sentences accurately describe the person, and was there a 1% chance they described the person, or was there a 99% chance they described the person? Now, in the case I was dealing with, it turned out that a great deal was copied into the report. The case I had, the judge found, quote, there was extensive copying directly from and non-analytical acceptance of these inappropriate Behaviordyne test results in such a fashion that it formed virtually the exclusive basis for the entire initial evaluation report. So basically, it had been completely copied from a printout. In the case I had, the judge found, quote, there was extensive copying directly from and non-analytical acceptance of these inappropriate behavior-dying test results in such a fashion that it formed virtually the exclusive basis for the entire initial evaluation report, completely copied from a printout. Now, here's a sample of a profile. Remember I said a MMPI profile has two parts. An MMPI report has two parts. I showed you a sample of sentences. This is what a behavior dying profile used to look like. Over here on this side is what were the what are called the validity scales. They have to do with the test taker's attitude towards the test, and over in the second half are what are called the clinical scales. Okay, so whenever you hear a psychologist talking about the profile, they're talking about this graph. That's what it means. Next. And now that they're coming on computer printouts, it's a lot harder for the psychologists to understand it. In the old days, psychologists understood what I just showed you quite well, and they used to score those by hand, but they don't do that anymore. Now, I had one psychologist who did score those by hand, and then he would use what was called the cookbook method, which means he'd score it by hand, and then he'd take a textbook here, which explains what each of those points on the graph means, and he'd copy out of this book, which actually I recommend this book. I'd like to recommend it quite highly. It's called the MMPI, A Practical Guide, second edition by John R. Graham. It's out of print, so you have to get it from a place that has out-of-print books. But it describes what the different clinical scales on the MMPI mean, and he goes through not only the negatives, but the positives. And let's face it, there's really not something wrong with having a personality. And in court, the psychologist will act like, oh my gosh, this person is histrionic. Well, I've been at a child's birthday party when a histrionic mother arrived, and a birthday party that was kind of blah. She came in and lit up the room when she arrived, and the child's party took off. Is it so bad to have a personality? Do we all have to be as dull as a white wall? Now, there are personality characteristics such as narcissism, which is basically being very self-centered. The kind of person who's a narcissist, when it's cold, they remember they're cold and they need a jacket, but they don't notice that the child is cold and the child needs a jacket. It's hard for that characteristic to have anything positive in a parenting context, even if it could have something positive in an employment context. But I recommend this because it tells you what each of the scales mean, and when you're being attacked for having a personality, you can point out how your personality actually could have some positives to it. But anyway, this psychologist would go through, and he'd do his reports going through the same characteristics in the same order for the man and for the woman, but because the man was gender biased, he would say that the same characteristic that was neutral or negative in a man was horrible for a woman. And he used what we call the cookbook method. Now, you want to move it up? In the man, he would say, lack of self-insight, failed to acknowledge even relatively minor mistakes and shortcomings, such as not always telling the truth. In the woman, he says lack of self-insight so extreme that she even goes so far as to deny even relatively minor mistakes and shortcomings, such as not always telling the truth. Next slide. Now the result of this was man got pretty good custody, and the woman ended up not able to see her daughter. I don't have another one that I can. He says, the man, Pollyannish outlook, and it didn't have any particular importance. The woman, Pollyannish outlook makes her very resistant to psychological explanations, rigid, uncooperative when confronted with her own problems and the need for change. He got 70% custody, up from 20%. She ended up eventually denied all contact. It was also a problem that the psychologist had Tourette's syndrome and was himself getting a divorce when he wrote these reports. You want to put it up? Now, the problem is if you have only one report, like your own, you can't prove gender bias. Not like it was proved when we had these reports. The problem is that a lot of local rules say you can't share reports with other people. So, and when you need them, you can't start making motions trying to get other people's report, and you don't want to violate the local rules and go to jail for contempt. The solution we had was a militant organization of parents that I had the advantage of having in my county. They got the report, and therefore we were able to, next slide, show what the situation was, expose the psychologist, and the sentences you saw went out in a leaflet and showed the public what he was doing. Now, the MMPI-2 eventually became a mystery, just like Isaac Asimov describes the point in the future in his science fiction books where robots have made and repaired robots for so long that people have forgotten how to do it. You want to move it up? It's become the same way with the MMPI. In this book, very interesting book, the computer and the decision-making process, very hard to get. There's a quote in there, consumers of computer-based test interpretations have very little information available on the development of the algorithm, meaning program, or validity of the program. Companies selling programs for scoring these psychological tests often do not provide a user's guide. The algorithms used in generating the computer interpretations are not available to test users, nor are they provided for scholarly review purposes. Numerous critics have pointed out serious problems arising from the growth of use of these programs. Mitchell, in 1984, observed that the advent of computer-based test interpretations presents the field of psychology with its most serious and consequential challenge of the next decade. And then it says, the evidence used to produce the computer interpretation may wind up locked in a black box, inaccessible to test users. Well, I assure you that prediction was completely right. It is exactly what has happened. Most psychologists, who, at least who we have run into in the forensic context, have no idea what is generating these sentences. If you were to ask them what answers generated this particular sentence about this particular client that you copied into your report, they would have no ability to answer that. Now, this slide didn't come out very well, but it shows you, here is person on couch talking to psychologist. In the old days, a good lawyer could cross-examine the psychologist. See, there's the psychologist taking the oath in the witness box. I want to move it up. And get them on the run. So here's the lawyer, got the psychologist on the run in the courtroom. How do you cross-examine a computer program? Next slide, because that's basically what we're confronted with, is a psychologist who's copied out of a computer program, and the psychologist has no idea how it got generated, how those sentences got generated. And what we found when we collected up a lot of reports from behavior dying was that report after report had the same sentences, and a lot of them were not particularly sentences that made very much sense. She gets emotionally involved in issues. Is that a bad thing? Okay, next slide. But it was our understanding that these printouts existed and were being copied that really let us know what was going on. So here's how you get underneath the report. This is what I do. I do a subpoena, and number one, I do a business records only subpoena in which I ask for everything the psychologist has in relation to the test. Okay, every memo, answer sheets, correspondence, their MMPIs, MCMIs, name every test they've done, any psychological studies they directly relied on, drawings, bills, curriculum vitae, independent documentation of supposed objective facts. Next slide. I also have a separate one for computer scoring services that I use. Results of drug and alcohol tests, videotapes, audio tapes, any complaints against the psychologist, any testimony the psychologist has done in other cases, anything they use to score the Rorschach. There, I might mention the Rorschach ink blot test. I was quite, next slide, I was quite surprised to find that while the Rorschach looks like pure art to us, in fact, they send the Rorschach to a computer scoring company, and it comes back with a printout. Now, after I do that business records only subpoena, and I study it, and I send it to my own expert psychologist that I'm working with, and I write out questions for the psychologist. And when you're questioning an expert psychologist, you probably have to type up your questions with the sentences all typed out, not just an outline. This is hard work. You type out the sentences. Then you do an in-person deposition of the psychologist. Now, sometimes people say to me, Robin, we don't have the money. Well, if you don't have the money, you skip the in-person deposition. You just get the records. It doesn't cost a lot of money to get the records. You get them and you think. It doesn't cost money to think. Now, when possible, you collect and you compare the reports. Now, it's going to be hard because county cover-up rules embodied in local rules are going to try to stop you. Oops, I mean the county concern for litigants' privacy. There is a legitimate concern by the counties in that it is true that some parents go home and spread the psychological evaluation around. I have had people do it, not my client, but I have seen parents give it to the school, give it to the friends, leave it on the coffee table, let the kids read it. It is wrong. That is certainly wrong. However, it is also the case that wrong is being done by these reports not being challenged, and I think we have to balance the two wrongs. Can you hold the side of the slides down? Now, these are samples of local rules. Los Angeles County, Santa Clara County. Put the bottom one up because that's Orange County. These are California local rules, of course. the Orange County rule is the granddaddy of them all because it says that you can't even let the client see them, and at the conclusion of each day of trial, all copies of the report shall be returned to the court clerk. How are you supposed to, next slide, how are you supposed to even hire an expert and defend yourself? I don't know. As far as I'm concerned, local rules that are contrary, that prevent you from preparing a defense violate the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution and are void and should be challenged. Where are you attorneys in Orange County? Come on, let's get to the Court of Appeal. Okay, you should compare the printout to the report. When we did this in the case that we were handling, we found that the portion of the report that was titled Analysis of Test Results should have been titled Copying of Printout. And we blew up the test result real big and then gave the psychologist a red marker and made her mark every place that she had copied from the report. Now that surprises the judge. However, put that up a little higher, if the printout is valid and accurately describes the tested subject, the evidence of copying, while humiliating to the plagiarist, would not invalidate the report. To do that, you have to go deeper, if you can, and invalidate, next slide, the printout itself. So, we got out our screwdriver and we had the lid of the paint can loose, but we kept trying. So one thing to do is call the competition. If you have a printout from one computer scoring service, call the competing computer scoring service and ask if they have any information indicating that they are better than the other computer scoring service. And when we did that, we learned about the EIDE study. The EIDE study was done by people connected with the U.S. Office of Personnel Management and Walter Reed Army Medical Center because they had the same question we had. Obviously, they were sending their MMPI test somewhere to be scored, and they wanted to know, do these sentences accurately describe our patients? So they wanted to know, where should we send our business? And they had huge resources and did a beautiful study in which they selected pairs of files of black and white patients, both inpatient and outpatient, from Walter Reed, and they already had MMPI profiles and complete psychiatric histories and answer sheets. Then they took those answer sheets and had 7 different computer scoring companies score the MMPI test. The sentences generated by the 7 companies were then judged by Walter Reed psychiatrists as to whether the sentences accurately described the patient. Behaviordyne, the company I was dealing with, scored worse. It scored very bad for subclinical normal people, which is most likely the people I was dealing with in family court. In fact, as to those people, the sentences were so bad that they were 94.1% inaccurate. 94% of the time, they didn't describe the people, and the psychologist I was dealing with was copying those sentences straight out of her printout into the report. Well, but the EIDE article was printed in '91, it was now 2000, and area psychologists were still using this behavior-guided computer scoring service. Was a judge going to toss it all out because of one article? In fact, they had tested 25,000 nuclear workers, in case you want to know whose finger is on the nuclear button in this country. And in our area, San Jose, if if a police officer shoots someone and kills them, they are still tested today, 2004, by the psychologists who own this company and this program. We have not succeeded in stopping that. Now, it wasn't just one article. We went to Burroughs, who puts out Mental Measurements Yearbook, which describes psychological tests. And you want to move that up? In 1972, 1978, 1985, and 1992, the Mental Measurements Yearbook had said that the behavior-dying people needed validation studies. Validity is the question of, does a psychological test actually test what it says it tests? And these people had no studies, not one, that proved that it really tested what it said it tested. Of course, because it didn't. So now, in addition to that one article, which showed its census didn't represent the people accurately, I had the most authoritative Mental Measurements Yearbook, next slide, constantly raising the question of where's the validity. Now, the APA, and this is a very important text that if you're going to be challenging a test, you go to the APA and you get its Standards for Educational and Psychological Testing from 1999, and they explain exactly what is required of people who sell test documents. For example, manuals should be made available to prospective test users. Now, these behavior-dying people were so dishonest that they sold, next slide, they sold the MMPI-2 manual that is sold by the actual owners of the Minnesota test, which was dishonest because they used a different normative base. Behavior-dying behavior data had zero data about their own normative base, and all they would give you was the MMPI-2 manual sold by the University of Minnesota. Well, the Burroughs Mental Measurements Yearbook article said that this person named Finney normed his program on people from Kentucky. So we very strongly suspected that, in fact, giving us the information from the actual MMPI-2 normative base that's normally used was not honest at all. Now, we took deposition of the owner of behavior-dying behavior data, and she said, I think the normative population was taken beyond the University of Kentucky. It was stratified to match the U.S. Census demographics available at the time. I'm going to move it up. And she says, I questioned her about it, that the Mental Measurements Yearbook says there doesn't seem to be systematic overall reliability and validity evaluations. And she says, well, I don't believe this is correct. This is her deposition transcript that you're looking at. And I said, well, am I correct in believing you can't give us any information on what group of people the behavior data printout was normed? And she says, I don't have it. Well, of course, the standards clearly, next slide, said that she should have it. She's a PhD psychologist, so she's certainly in violation. And then she offers me this 300 article bibliography. Well, most people were snowed by the 300 article bibliography, but I hired an expert, Dr. Chastain, who had a JD and a PhD in educational psychology from Stanford, and he plowed through the 300 article bibliography, and there was nothing there that showed that her printout was valid. Nothing. Okay, then we brought in Dr. Terry Johnston, who also she was the one who copied the sentences, if you want to raise it up for me, into her report. And I asked her, and she said, Finney got a grant to do a new normalization sample. He went this is her deposition, over the country, looking for people who fit the census profile. He had therapists from all over the country send in those. Next, so here I've got my little screwdriver and I'm trying to pry the lid off of the paint can, and I have two psychologists standing on the paint can lid, jumping on it, trying to hold it on. So I had two PhDs telling me that the normative base of behavior data was perfectly adequate. And you know, next slide, most attorneys would give up at that point. Well, we located Joseph Finney between the bankruptcy records and the investigator's favorite tool, the phone book. We succeeded in locating him. He was, in fact, in his day, a great pioneer who had put together the computer and psychology, a great man who towered over the midgets we were dealing with, and I have to hand it to him. However, Dr. Finney confirmed, raise it up, all of his subjects used in norming this computer program were from Lexington County, Kentucky, 1965 to 1970. Everything those two PhD psychologists had testified to was false. Okay. Now, well, so what? Does it matter? What's wrong with a system normed in 1965 to 70 on Kentuckians and applied in the 1990s to San Joseans? You may have to present an expert in demographics to show what's different. Remember, a judge wants evidence. They're not going to assume that it matters. So I went to the, you want to move it up? I went to the Kentucky official website, and even now, in the year 2000, when my trial was occurring, the Kentucky website still made it sound like the state really felt the Civil War was won by the wrong side. This is following the war's end. Kentuckian sympathies were aligned much more closely with those of the southern states. I was like, oh boy. The Civil Rights Act wasn't passed until '64, and it took a long time to have an effect. Dr. Finney began his sample in '65. It seems safe to assume that society's life in Kentucky in '65 was very, very significantly different than life in Silicon Valley in the 90s, where employers had pulled in employees from all over the world to do .com, and the area was very, very multi-ethnic, and everyone was walking around with a cell phone in their ear. The Blue Hills of 1960s Kentucky were nothing like 1990s Silicon Valley. Kentucky is called the Bluegrass State. Well, I got a copy of the 1966 World Book Encyclopedia. It says rich tobacco and champion racehorses have long been symbols of Kentucky. It was after our trial that the Kentucky Quarter with the racehorse on it came out. It also said, the World Book also said thoroughbred racehorses still graze on the rich grass of the region around Lexington. And it was around Lexington that Dr. Finney obtained his sample population, a far cry from people in San Jose rushing around talking on cell phones and working on their laptops. The specific people we had in the divorce I was dealing with were a plastic surgeon and a former emergency room nurse. Okay, next slide. Okay, now what was really interesting was to me, and what really the judge really took into consideration was that it turned out that, you want to move it up so this is at the top, Behaviordyne, that's good, the Behaviordyne program, as it turned out, had bias written into the very lines of the computer program, and that's what you're looking at here. So that it had sentences it would print out about a woman that could not be printed out about a man. So that if the score on certain variables and true-false answers on the MMPI-2 came out a certain way, it would generate the value, $00175, which would generate the sentence, the way so-and-so behaves toward men is very feminine indeed, but it's also spiteful and hateful. She may or may not be aware of it, but she nurses a deep grudge against men. There was also a sentence about harbors a deep grudge against men. Can you imagine in a custody case, which automatically includes a woman and a man, and often a little boy, how terrible a sentence like this is? And then there were sentences about women's use of sexuality as a weapon to punish men. There were no flip side of this. Now, in the better computer scoring services, if you change the gender of the person who is responding, okay, on the answer sheet it asks male or female, the printout will change he to she. That's all that will change. But in Behaviordyne, things like this happen. Now it also has sentences about the man. It will say he is a highly cultured man. But it could not say she is a highly cultured woman. It also would say nasty things about the man. His interests are narrow. Next slide. But there was no way to say the woman's interests are narrow, because after all, who's interested in the interests of a mere woman? This was a very 1960s printout. Now, on this one, it has some other interesting things, like, let's see. She is feminine in the best sense of the word. Motherly, gentle, patient, and sincere. She acts like a man and not like a woman. That means she goes after what she wants, and sometimes impatiently. Next slide. This is a really historical classic. Oh, way up. There's now, interestingly enough, all of these sentences are based on one of the, on that graph that's called a profile, there's one of the bars that is it's called the MF scale. It's not really a clinical scale. And it was developed for when male homosexuals came to psychologists wanting treatment for the problem of being a homosexual. And then they eventually flipped it over and used it also for females. It is not legitimate for use in a forensic case, meaning a court case, ever. Never, it is never to be used. The forensic manual for the MMPI-2 says never use it in a court case, never, never, never. And yet, this computer program churned out these sentences, and these sentences were used to deny women custody. They destroyed many lives. And these sentences, interestingly enough, say, so-and-so is effeminate, he may well have homosexual tendencies and is full of unmanly complaints. It is likely that so-and-so has homosexual relations with other men. Next slide. Now, the psychologist was modern enough that she knew better than to copy these in the custody report. The behavior data program has a lot of these sentences, and the doctor was able to show, the PhD psychologist we had showed that these sentences were built into the program, and indeed the woman I represented, the computer program printed out, she nurses a deep grudge against men. Yeah, and it says about the next page, says that, it should not be used. Now, the other thing you can do when you're faced with this kind of a problem is send your printout to the other computer scoring companies and have them score it and see what happens. So number one, change the gender of the person you're dealing with on the computer scoring sheet and send it back in. Number two, change the gender and leave the gender the same and send it to other computer companies to score. And the behavior guide was the only one that called the woman a borderline personality disorder, and this was very important to the judge in our case. This is what he ruled. The use of the behavior dyne scoring process was inappropriate in that, and then parentheses, this is where he dismisses some of the issues that were dear to my heart. Issues such as representativeness, lack of description of norms, and the inability to demonstrate validity or reliability aside, it is gender biased, causing substantially different results and diagnoses for identical answers based solely upon whether a male or female is responding. So getting a decision that says something is gender biased out of a judge is very hard, and they don't want to say an individual is gender biased. But when you really get down and show that the bias is built into the lines of a computer program, this judge was willing to say that. Next slide. Now, the other thing you end up doing when you get very good at this is to show not only what is in the report, but what is not in the report. Because most lawyers, unfortunately, in family court, tend to just go in there and do what seems logical to them and what comes from their gut. And it's easy to say how you feel about something. You look at it, you see if it's logical, whatever. But sometimes it can be very important what is not in the report. And I wanted to give you an example, a book by Catherine Keenly, Kuehnle, was very important in another trial I just did, assessing allegations of child sexual abuse. In that case, the psychologist had done a so-called investigation of child sexual abuse, but she had used the MMPI, for example, which is not designed to determine whether someone has post-traumatic stress syndrome, and it's not designed to determine if children have been sexually molested. So she gave the test which would not find sexual abuse, and the test in here that will tell you whether a child has been sexually molested or will help you determine that hadn't been given. So it was really important to find out what a correct investigation would look like. What does a correct psychological evaluation look like? And show not just that this one doesn't make any sense, but what's a good one look like? What's not there? So it listed the tests that should have been done. It listed the kinds of interviews that should have been done and weren't done. And that was particularly important in showing what was lacking. Now, the other thing that you want to do is under the question of ethics. You're going to have to go to the APA website, and these aren't particularly important because I haven't updated them. They just changed recently, but the thing to know is, next, you're going to have to go to the APA, American Psychological website, and find out about them. Where do ethics come from? Ethics come from membership in a professional society, okay? An attorney's ethics come from membership in the State Bar Association. A psychologist's ethics come from membership in a professional association such as the American Psychological Association. A psychiatrist, the American Psychiatric Association. So you need to find out what are the ethics to which they subscribe, and then you go through and look at them and learn them and see have they followed them. One of the most commonly violated is multiple relationships, dual relationships. It is particularly improper for a psychologist to have both a confidential and a non-confidential relationship. It has to be either there is a therapeutic confidential relationship and everything is confidential, or there is a forensic court-related relationship and the person is reporting to the court and nothing is confidential. The person cannot have a mix of relationships where they're doing therapy and they're reporting to the court and they're somehow doing therapy and still keeping everything a secret. That is not going to work out, although they often think so. Now, one of the things that happens, could you flatten that one out, is that things may be very much, it's worse than you think. In the case I had, the court's neutral evaluator, so-called, loses her notebook. And she gets up in court and says, "Somebody stole my notebook." So the people in the audience realize this person probably lost her notebook. So they go look in the bathroom, and there it is. So they give me the notebook. Well, the day before, we had asked this person who teaches psychologists classes in domestic violence, "Can you name even one book about domestic violence?" And no, she couldn't. So the next day, she brings us a list of books on her bookshelf that have to do with domestic violence, like I care what she has on her bookshelf. Anyway, the list she gave to me in the court stopped here. Above this point was a secret list of books, and it's a note to father's attorney, with whom the court's neutral psychologist was totally aligned, and says, these have very relevant articles you may want to ask me about. And she's written over there on the left, Marty, which is the name of father's attorney, and we only found the secret note to father's attorney because she lost her notebook and then was stupid enough to tell everybody about it. This is how biased and unethical the person was. So yes, you need to learn about the ethics. Things may well be very much worse than you could possibly have imagined. Now, after scientifically dissecting the report, you need to humanize your case and make the judge want to rule in your favor. Merely showing what's wrong with the psychologist's report will not win your case. You need to make the judge feel what's right about your case. One of the things I recommend is to take the power and control wheel and go around it, giving examples. On the outside, we have physical abuse at the top, sexual abuse at the bottom, but here we have threats of force, intimidation, emotional abuse, etc. And so, you want to move it up a little? You go through examples of what happens, denying, blaming, not taking the person's concerns seriously, denying the importance of the abuse, saying the abuse never happened, not taking responsibility for abuse, blaming the other person for the abuse. Unfortunately, all this is termed phrased in terms of using male privilege, and the fact is you may have an abused male. I have represented abused male clients. It's fairly rare. It's a low percent, but it does happen. But you need to take the person around the power and control wheel and give examples of every single thing. Under intimidation, we have harming pets, and I have been really impressed with the number of cases we see where pets have been harmed by the abuser. And you may have families that look normal, it looks like there's a normal pet, but the fact is, if you talk to the child, you find there has been a whole string of pets. There have been too many pets. The pets have died. And so it's kind of like juggling. The abuser manages to keep the pet in the house, but that's because a whole string of pets are dying and getting given away. And I strongly recommend Child Abuse, Domestic Violence, and Animal Abuse, edited by Frank Ascione, A-S-C-I-O-N-E, and Phil Arkow. I'm not sure where you could get it. It's Purdue University Press. It's absolutely fabulous. To me, there's a very clear link between animal abuse and child abuse. I've had a situation where a child is brought in front of a evaluator, in fact, the same very poor evaluator, and they were looking for sexual abuse, but he was a physical abuser too. They eventually recommended he have custody. And the child says to her dad, "Dad, you threw the puppy against the wall." And he's like, he starts immediately minimizing, denying, right in front of the psychologist, and he's like, "Oh, it was only a puppy." And the child, obviously afraid he will do the same to the child, says, "Dad, his teeth fell out." And the dad says, "They were only baby teeth." And it was such classic minimization and denial. And the red flags and warning bells were going off all over the place. And the psychologist refused to see any of them and eventually gave him custody. It was a very terrible situation for the child. So anyway, I'm hoping that today we've given you the tools so that you can engage in not just the skim the surface or the respond with common sense to a psychological evaluation, but to understand these evaluations are knowable. You can roll up your sleeves, do some hard work, and I hope we've given you the screwdriver that's going to allow you to take that old paint can lid off, pry the paint can lid off, and see the real truth that's underneath.